I remember the sound of the engines. A steady hum, almost soothing. I leaned my head against the window, watching the sun flicker off the wing. It felt like any other flight. Routine. Safe. Then the first tremor. A small shake, barely noticeable. I ignored it. Then another, stronger this time. The seatbelt light blinked on. A drink on the tray table rippled. The overhead compartments rattled. My fingers curled around the armrest, but I told myself it was just turbulence. Then we dropped. My stomach lurched as everything inside the plane lifted for a second before slamming back down. The cabin shook violently. People gasped. A flight attendant near the front grabbed the wall for support. I saw it in their eyes, this wasn't normal. Then came the explosion. A deep, metallic bang, louder than anything I've ever heard. The plane jerked sideways, and my head slammed against the window. A scream, someone's, maybe mine, pierced through the roaring noise. The lights flickered. I turned toward the aisle just as the overhead bins burst open. Bags tumbled out, hitting people, rolling into the aisle. Someone across from me was clutching their mask, struggling to breathe. That's when I noticed, the oxygen masks had dropped. That's when I knew. Through the window, a fireball erupted along the wing. Smoke trailed behind us, thick and black against the fading sky. The plane tilted harder, too hard. My body pressed into the seat as we fell. Everything was chaos. A child crying. A phone slipping from someone's grasp. Loose paper and debris floating in the air like we were in zero gravity. The wind screaming through a crack in the fuselage. I closed my eyes. This is it. A brutal, shattering force ripped me from my seat. The world flipped. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and then, blackness. For a long time, I heard nothing. Then, slowly, sound crept back in. A faint ringing. The crackle of flames. The distant groan of something collapsing. Pain was the first thing I felt. A deep, throbbing ache spreading through my ribs, my head, my legs. Every breath burned. Every movement sent sharp jolts through my body. But I was alive. The air was thick with smoke, tinged with the acrid stench of burning fuel. Flames crackled in the wreckage, casting flickering shadows across the ground. Metal groaned as pieces of the plane shifted and collapsed in on themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a voice coughed. A shape moved through the haze, a woman, limping, one arm clutching her side. Someone else, barely able to stand, using the wing as support. We were the lucky ones. I forced myself up, legs shaking beneath me. My hand found a piece of the fuselage, still hot from the flames. The cockpit was completely gone. Torn away on impact. The nose of the plane had crumpled, unrecognizable. There was no sign of the pilots. I stumbled forward, my feet crunching over shattered glass and twisted metal. A suitcase lay torn open, clothes scattered across the dirt. A phone screen flickered weakly, its last recorded moment frozen in time, a blurry shot of the burning wing. More survivors gathered, faces streaked with blood and soot. A man was pressing his hands against a deep wound on his leg. Another was trying to wake someone who wasn't waking up. A child sat on the ground, clutching a stuffed bear. Completely silent. Eyes blank. My heart pounded. We needed help. Where were the rescue teams? I turned, searching for anything, a radio, a beacon, a sign that someone knew we were here. But there was nothing. No sirens. No approaching helicopters. Not even the distant hum of engines. Nothing. A cold realization crept in. We were alone. And then, movement. Not from the wreckage, beyond it. Through the smoke and trees, past the shattered remains of the plane, something was there. A shape, barely visible. Tall. Still. Watching. My breath caught. I blinked, trying to focus, but when the smoke shifted, it was gone. Had I imagined it? A trick of the fire, the exhaustion? Then, another sound. Not from us. Not from the burning wreck. A faint, rhythmic beeping. I turned sharply toward the noise. It was coming from the back half of the plane, the section that had torn away mid-crash. It was half buried in the trees, metal twisted like a crumpled can. I moved toward it, stepping over debris, forcing my aching body forward. As I got closer, I saw a flashing red light blinking faintly in the darkness. A transponder. The emergency beacon. A surge of relief hit me. It was still working. I reached for it, then stopped. The panel it was attached to had been removed. Not ripped away in the crash. Unscrewed. Carefully. Deliberately. I stared. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone had disabled it. Someone had made sure no one would find us. A shadow passed behind me. A presence. Close. I spun around, but nothing. Just darkness. The fire behind me barely illuminated the trees. The other survivors were still near the wreckage, unaware. I wasn't alone. And for the first time since the crash, I felt something deeper than fear. I felt hunted. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Too quiet. No wind. No animals. Just the distant crackle of burning wreckage and the labored breathing of the survivors behind me. But I knew I wasn't alone. The emergency beacon blinked weakly at my feet. My mind raced. The panel had been removed on purpose. Someone had made sure the distress signal wouldn't go out. That meant they were here. Watching. My skin prickled. I turned back toward the wreckage, forcing myself to move, forcing myself not to run. Running would make noise. Running would let them know I knew. A few of the other survivors had gathered what little they could: torn bags, half-burned supplies, a single, cracked water bottle. Some were injured too badly to move. Others just sat in shock, staring at nothing. A man was kneeling beside a woman, pressing his jacket against a wound on her shoulder. A teenager clutched a bent, useless phone. I swallowed hard. Do I tell them? Do I tell these people, who have already lived through hell, that we're not alone? That someone doesn't want us to be found? My chest tightened. No. Not yet. I needed to be sure. The first priority was survival. Find food. Find water. Wait for rescue, if it ever came. I looked up. The sun was getting lower. Soon, it would be dark. And I had a feeling we wouldn't want to be out here after dark. The fire from the wreckage was dying. The once bright flames had shrunk to smoldering embers, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature was dropping fast. We had nothing, no flashlights, no real shelter, barely any supplies. Someone had found a few blankets in the wreckage, but that was it. I sat with my back against a piece of the fuselage, eyes scanning the treeline. Watching. Listening. The other survivors were trying to sleep. Some were whispering. Others just sat in silence, too shaken to rest. Then, a sound. Soft. Distant. A branch snapping. I stiffened. Not from the wreckage. From the trees. I turned slowly, heart pounding. Something moved. A flicker of motion in the darkness. A shape, just at the edge of the firelight. Then another. Shadows. Not one. More than one. They were circling us. I opened my mouth to say something, to warn the others, but then. The beeping started again. The emergency beacon. The one I had found earlier, the one I had seen disabled, was blinking. Flashing faster. I stared. It was turning on. Someone had reactivated it. My blood ran cold. Why? Then I understood. The beacon wasn't for rescue. It was a signal. A call. And whatever was out there in the trees was answering. The blinking light from the emergency beacon was the only thing breaking the darkness. Its red flash cut through the night, illuminating the smoke in the air and the twisted remnants of the plane. But instead of offering any comfort, it felt like a countdown. A signal that was about to attract something far worse than rescue. The others didn't notice at first. They were too exhausted, too shaken to even hear the faint beeping over the crackling of the remaining fires. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The more I stared at the blinking red light, the more I felt like something was closing in on us. Then, another snap of a branch. This time closer. I looked toward the sound, breath caught in my throat. The shadows were moving again. No one else seemed to hear it. My mind raced, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something worse. This overwhelming sensation that we were being watched. Not by animals or the wilderness, but by something else entirely. Something human. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My knees ached, but I forced myself forward. My eyes darted across the survivors. No one was looking at me. They were all focused on whatever had caught their attention, a flickering fire, a half-constructed shelter. I moved toward the wreckage, closer to the beacon. I could almost feel the eyes on me from the trees, just beyond the light. I kept my back to the survivors. The shadows felt like they were crawling closer. As I neared the wreckage, I spotted something strange. A footprint. It was fresh. I crouched, my heart thumping in my chest. The ground was soft from the crash, and the footprint was clear against the dirt. But what struck me, it was too large. Not just the size of a man's foot, but something bigger. Something unnatural. Then it clicked. The shadow I'd seen earlier. The way it had moved, barely visible but never quite disappearing. They were close. I straightened up and turned back toward the survivors, but as I did, something cracked, a stick snapping beneath weight. I froze. And then, voices. Faint, low whispers, too soft to catch the words, but there was no mistaking it. The sound of human voices. I couldn't breathe. There were people out there. People who weren't part of the crash. I backed up toward the wreckage, adrenaline pumping in my veins. My thoughts raced. What did they want? What were they doing out here? I glanced back again, just in time to see a dark figure step out from the shadows at the edge of the trees. It wasn't human, the figure was too tall, too wide, moving too fluidly for something that should have been standing still. It didn't look like a person. I didn't wait for a second look. I turned and ran. I wasn't sure how far I ran. My legs burned with the effort, but the fear pushing me forward was stronger than the pain. I could hear the others shouting behind me, but I couldn't stop. I knew that whatever was in the woods was getting closer. I had to get to the wreckage, to the beacon, something that would keep me from being caught. The night air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. And then, a sound from behind. Not footsteps. Something heavier. A low, growling noise. The sound of something hunting. I pushed harder, my chest tight, my heart hammering in my ears. The wreckage was closer now, but I could hear it, the thing, getting closer. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The figure was there again. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more. A small group, moving in the shadows just beyond the trees. They were too fast, too quiet. And they were closing in on me. I stumbled, barely catching myself as I hit the ground. My hands dug into the dirt, scrambling to regain my footing. My heart was in my throat as I scrambled toward the wreckage, trying to ignore the cold sweat running down my back. One more step. Then, a hand. A cold, unnatural hand grabbed my ankle. I kicked out, hearing a grunt behind me. The grip loosened, but the pull had been strong enough to send me sprawling across the dirt. I didn't look back this time. I just ran. I reached the wreckage. I didn't stop running until my hands touched the twisted remains of a wing. The beacon was flashing faster now. The signal was getting stronger. They had found me. But it wasn't rescue that was coming. I looked back. The figures were back in the trees and had stopped moving. They were still. Watching. I don't know how I knew, but I understood. They were waiting. Waiting for the others to get close. I crawled into the wreckage, my breath ragged. I pressed myself against the cold metal, too scared to even think about what was out there in the darkness. We wasn't alone. And whatever was out there, wasn't leaving. The night felt endless. We had huddled together as best as we could, wrapped in the remnants of blankets and clothes scavenged from the wreckage. The others had been too exhausted to keep watch. Some had fallen asleep almost immediately, others drifted in and out of consciousness. I stayed awake, pressing my back to the wreckage, eyes darting toward the trees every time a branch creaked. The figures in the woods had never come closer, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. Every rustling leaf sent a jolt of panic through me. Every distant noise felt like they were closing in. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. Not until daylight. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the overwhelming need to rest, or the soft lull of the wind as it passed over the wreckage. But eventually, I drifted off. I woke to the sound of something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it swirled around the wreckage, carrying a faint hum in the distance. But then the noise grew louder. A low rumble. My heart stopped. It wasn't an engine sound I recognized, not like a helicopter or a plane overhead. It was a boat. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking from the cold and the night spent lying on the hard ground. I looked around, panic rising, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't sure if it was real, if it was just my mind playing tricks after a sleepless night. But then the sound came again. A steady thrum of a boat engine. Rescue. I shot a glance around the wreckage. The others were still asleep, too deeply lost in their exhaustion to hear it. I couldn't wait. I had to get their attention. I rushed over to the group of survivors, shaking them awake, calling out to them in a frantic whisper. Wake up. They're here. The rescue team is here. At first, no one responded. Their faces were pale, drawn with the exhaustion of a night spent in fear. I shook a woman awake, her eyes fluttered open, then focused on me. What? Her voice was hoarse. The boat, I said, almost breathless. They found us. They're coming. A moment passed, then her eyes widened. She turned to the others, shaking them awake one by one. They didn't hesitate. Everyone stood, limping toward the edge of the wreckage, leaning on each other for support. Their eyes flicked toward the horizon where the sound of the boat had grown louder. But something still gnawed at me. The beacon had been flashing, yes, but how had they found us? There had been no radio signal, no emergency call. How had anyone known where we were? The boat drew closer, the engine hum growing louder. The survivors were limping forward now, some barely able to stand, but we were all moving as fast as we could. The beach where we'd crash-landed was just ahead. I could see the faint outline of people in the boat, hands waving toward us. We were saved. But as we neared the shore, something inside me didn't settle. Not completely. I felt a pull to turn around, a strange, unsettling feeling. Like something was still behind me. Watching. I pushed it aside. I had to focus on what was real. The boat anchored at the shore, and a few figures jumped out, rushing toward us. Their uniforms were familiar, rescue workers. I could see the relief in their eyes as they took in the scene, stragglers from a disastrous crash. We were being rescued. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't over yet. As the survivors were helped into the boat, I turned for a last look at the wreckage, at the dark woods that surrounded us. The shadows still seemed too deep, too still. Something wasn't right. But for now, there were no shadows at the shore. Just the boat. Just the rescue. As the boat pulled away from the shore, the wreckage of Flight 308 shrank behind us, swallowed by the trees and the darkness of the distant jungle. The hum of the boat's engine seemed louder now, almost comforting in its steady rhythm. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze hit my face, but I couldn't shake the cold knot in my stomach. The survivors sat in silence, their faces pale, weary, still in shock. The water felt too calm, too peaceful compared to the chaos we had just escaped. The boat cut through the waves, leaving the island behind, and the closer we got to the mainland, the more I felt a strange disconnect. We should have been celebrating, rejoicing in the fact that we were alive, but instead, something gnawed at the back of my mind. When we arrived at the shore, paramedics and authorities rushed toward us, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. They immediately began attending to the injured, checking vitals, providing water. But they were also looking at us, really looking. Their eyes flicking back and forth as they began asking questions. "What happened out there?" one of the rescue workers asked. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of unease beneath it. "The crash, it was brutal," I said, still breathless from the adrenaline of the past few hours. "But there were people. In the woods. Watching us." A heavy silence fell over the group. They exchanged looks. "People," one of them repeated, voice tight. "We didn't find anyone else out there." I stared at him, my throat dry. They were in the woods, near the wreckage. They were watching us, waiting. Something wasn't right. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the tall figures, the shadows. The way they moved. But I couldn't explain it, not in a way they would understand. One of the survivors, who hadn't said much, stepped forward. His face was bruised, his clothes torn. "She's right," he said, voice low, as if the very words might betray us. "We saw them too. People. Or things. We weren't alone." The rescuer's eyes narrowed, but instead of pressing further, he took a step back, making a note on his clipboard. "We'll look into it," he said, his voice now more cautious. "But for now, you all need to rest. We've got you. You're safe." The weight of the days on the island was slowly lifting, replaced by the slow, almost surreal sense of normalcy that washed over us as we stepped into the world we had once known. But for me, something felt wrong. The rescue had come, finally. But something still gnawed at me. How had they found us? How had they known where we were? Why had the rescue taken so long? I couldn't shake the feeling that the events on the island hadn't just been about survival. Something had happened out there, something that couldn't be explained. And no one else seemed to be asking the questions I couldn't stop thinking about. Back at home, the world felt almost indifferent to our ordeal. The media buzzed with news of our survival. Interviews, stories, the usual frenzy that followed such a tragedy. But as much as we had endured, something felt out of place. The rescue team, none of them seemed to know the full truth. I couldn't let it go. I spoke to the family of one of the passengers, the person who had been the first to speak out about the signals. His wife had been insistent about sending messages, contacting anyone she could. She had pushed for it, against the advice of authorities, to ensure the flight's disappearance was acknowledged properly. It was that push, that urgency, that seemed to have made the difference. But why had it taken so long? The authorities hadn't received the distress signals on time, hadn't responded as quickly as they should have. The truth had to be hidden somewhere in the delays, the miscommunication. The wreckage wasn't hard to find, not once the signal had been sent, yet, the response had been slow. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I stared out the window. The city outside looked normal, no different than it had before the crash. And yet, I couldn't escape the growing sense that the world had moved on too quickly. We had survived. But how had we survived? I dug into the records, the search logs, the timeline of events. There were gaps, missing details. Communications were fragmented, and it was clear that someone, somehow, had prevented the rescue from happening sooner. And then I found it. A mention, buried deep in a report, almost as an afterthought: Flight 308, secondary signal not prioritized. A cold shiver ran through me as I read those words. Was it a mistake? An oversight? Or something more? I began to suspect that there were forces at play, forces beyond the crash. What if it wasn't just the crash? What if there was something about the signal, about the island, something that someone didn't want us to find? I couldn't prove it. There was no way to connect all the pieces, but the longer I thought about it, the more it made sense. The island had been untouched by human presence, the wreckage so isolated. It wasn't a typical crash site. And what if that's why it took so long for the rescue? Maybe we weren't just stranded in the jungle. Maybe we were kept there. The more I thought about the figures in the trees, the way they had watched us. The way the jungle had felt alive, too alive. I remembered their stillness, their strange unhuman movements. I couldn't forget the look in their eyes, the way they had seemed to sense us, to know we were there, but not come any closer. It was as if we were never meant to leave that place. Then, as the memories of the island replayed over and over in my mind, a chilling thought struck me. The island was never meant to be found. It was no accident that the rescue had been delayed. Someone knew we were there and chose to ignore it. The figures in the woods, whatever they were, whoever they were, had been a warning, a barrier. And then, I realized, we had barely escaped. I might never know the truth. I might never understand why they let us survive, why they allowed the families to send the message that eventually brought us home. But one thing was certain: we had been found because someone allowed it. And there were still questions that might never be answered. Years had passed since we were rescued. The world had moved on, and so had I, at least on the surface. But deep down, the questions never stopped. The gnawing feeling, the unanswered pieces of the puzzle, still haunted me. The crash, the island, the dark figures watching from the trees. I couldn't let go, the memories lingered. There were moments when I would wake up, drenched in sweat, as if the shadows were still closing in. As if something from that island was waiting for the right time to return. One morning, as I was sitting at my desk, a headline caught my eye. It was buried deep in a news feed, a government leak. Classified documents about an island, eerily similar to the crash site. It wasn't just a coincidence. The coordinates matched. The island and the documents had the same isolated geography, the same dense, impenetrable jungle. But this wasn't just any ordinary island, it was labeled as a site for experiments. A lab. A place where research had been conducted far from the eyes of the public. The documents detailed how the island had been used for testing, but nothing about the figures that watched us from the trees. No mention of the strange, tall figures that had stalked us during that long sleepless night. The documents didn't explain the things we had seen, the figures, the shadows, the way the jungle had felt alive. Instead, they outlined vague research programs on genetics, rare diseases, and even biological experiments. But the timing was even more chilling. The lab had been abandoned just a year before our crash. I couldn't believe it. This was the island. The same one we had crash-landed on. But the truth was too carefully hidden. They had erased everything. Everything except the lab, the research, and a few scattered details about the place's dark past. The figures, the watchers, had been completely omitted from these records. Why? I stared at the screen, the weight of the years pressing down on me. What had really happened out there? What had we been part of? Then, not long after, another article surfaced. The headline made my blood run cold: missing scientist linked to disappearing researcher on Flight 308. I clicked the link with trembling fingers. The article detailed how a scientist from the same abandoned lab had been reported missing, a Dr. Marcus Vane, someone with high-level security clearance. The chilling part was that the article suggested Dr. Vane had been aboard Flight 308. The plane crash wasn't just an accident, it seemed. No, it was no random disaster. Dr. Marcus Vane, a key scientist in the lab's experiments, had been on board. The same person who may have had critical information about the genetic research that had been carried out on that island, research that was now erased from history. As I read through the article, something clicked. If Dr. Vane had been on that plane, it meant something far darker. The crash, the figures, the watchers in the jungle, they were all connected to him. Maybe it wasn't just an accident. What if he had been carrying something dangerous? Something worth hiding at all costs? The experiments from the island, whatever they were, could have involved dangerous biological or genetic elements. Perhaps those figures weren't just strange shadows, but guardians, watching over the secrets of the island. There were more leaks about the lab, its mysterious funding, the strange research it had conducted in isolation, and the connections between the scientist and the experiments. But when I tried to get more details, the information was obscured, as if someone was actively suppressing the truth. And the figures in the jungle? They had never been mentioned. No one had spoken about them. Not in the documents, not in any of the official statements. They were ghosts, forgotten by history. As I sat in my living room, piecing together the fragments, a cold realization washed over me: the crash wasn't just a freak accident. It was part of something planned, and we had been the unwitting pawns in someone's twisted game. The island, the lab, the experiments, it was all connected. But I would never know the full extent of what had happened there. It was buried, hidden, waiting for someone to uncover it. The world had moved on, but for me, the questions were as alive as ever. The pieces didn't fit, and they might never fit. The figures watching us, the scientist on board, the secrecy, it was all too much to ignore. In the end, I had to ask myself one question: had we escaped the crash, or had we been let go?
Like, subscribe, and share it with someone you think might enjoy the story. Give us your thoughts on what was the actual reason the plane crashed.